executive order of President Taft. This was a 300 square mile area of withdrawn public land for rangeland research. So that means it's public land, but it is intended exclusively for rangeland research. And that's been the case since 1912. And therefore, we can install research infrastructure that might otherwise be damaged or vandalized, which is, of course, getting to be a more important problem lately, but we can exclude people or be selective about who we let on to the range, primarily for research. This has been a testing ground for many new concepts and methods over the years. The Canfield method was developed on the Jornada a long time ago. And of course, we have more modern methods of rangeland monitoring that we're working with now. But a lot of these methods that are developed on the Jornada using that infrastructure are now used across the country and across the world. This is also the land base for research by many scientists and networks, including the long-term Ecological Research Program, the scientists associated with that. There are scientists that come with their own funding to do research, and we have dozens of scientists and students at any one time actively doing research on the Jornada. And we accumulate all of that data in our databases and all the papers in our publications database so that can be made available and shared among all researchers. We also host a number of instruments associated with networks, the USDA UV network, Climate Reference Network, and the National Ecological Observatory. So more importantly than what, why? Why was the Jornada established, and what function has it served and does it serve now? Primarily, again, referring to our mission statement, to promote sustainability of agriculture and other land uses where sustainability is defined as the reconciliation of society's development goals with environmental limits over the long term. So there's simultaneously inherent in this definition and in a lot of the philosophy of the USDA Agricultural Research Service of some balance, some desire to promote production, to promote rural economies, but also to stay within environmental limits and to promote other ecosystem services. And of course, the Jornada was established primarily because this relationship fell apart in the late 19th and early 20th century with the cattle boom, our first big sustainability crisis, modern sustainability crisis within the region. And this had three ingredients that are still operating in various forms across the world today. Environmental variability, such as drought in southern plains at that time, that drove a lot of ranchers and cattle from the east to the west. Technological change, fences, in particular railroads that allowed those cattle to be shipped in and for the meat to be shipped out. And then societal and economic change, the evolution of markets in the east that created demand for this beef. But these three ingredients form our primary issues with change even now. There was the consequences of misunderstood environmental limits after the sustainability crisis that were recognized by many of the early rangeland scientists like Elmer Wooten, who founded the Jornada. And so the questions that were posed were how to adapt and manage within the limits imposed by aridity. Given that grazing pressures were too high, we saw denuded landscapes and lots of cattle death in this time. And so our early research was primarily around restoring rangeland production. This began with the U.S. Forest Service, which the Jornada was a part of in 1915, and kind of continued into the 1960s, where our focus was on carrying capacity, season of use, utilization, some of these great old drawings from 1935 that are still pretty much how you think about utilization on black grama grass now. We began long-term monitoring programs such as our Jornada Quadrat project with data going back to 1915 to demonstrate the gradual recovery in response to good management. And then there were many early attempts at restoration of areas that had undergone transitions from grasslands to shrublands early, such as fencing out rodents and cattle, and then this failed attempt to plant flat grama in bags in mesquite dunes because the rodents were eating them when they tried to plant them directly. So they put them in the bags, but as you can see, the rodents would just take up the bag. So the 1950s drought, these were all things that began 1915, 1935, 37, and the 1950s drought changed everything because we learned that we didn't know very much about the variability of these systems. This is my predecessor, Fred Ares, research leader in 1951, and he states, December closed a year which was the most disastrous in Jornada history. It is certainly heartbreaking to see what was recently good black grama range subjected to such treatment after all the years of protective effort. And this is a really important passage in his annual report because it expresses not only regret but the surprise that he had that everything that we were trying to do to that point had been ruined by this drought and our management regime with respect to environmental variability. So since the 1970s and the advent of ecosystem science, the Jornada's research shifted gears. It wasn't just about management, but we needed to understand more about the ecology of these systems in order to implement good management. And so it began with the International Biological Program, and then really came into full flower with the LTER in 1982. This is Bill Schlesinger, one of the earlier research leaders, and that's Deborah Peters over here in the front row, who is the current principal investigator for the LTER program. And we went through a number of models of how these systems work that have evolved over time. And this has resulted in dispelling 3 myths that have really limited our ability to understand and respond to the conditions of the southwestern grasslands. First, the idea that these systems are inherently at some level stable. We know there's variability, but that there was enough stability that we could deal with it. It was minor relative to our recommendations. And of course, what we found is that arid rangelands are very variable. We can see here from some of the LTER net primary production data in grassland and a shrubland, how much variability in pounds per acre you get on the Jornada over, what's that, a 15-year period. From 200 pounds per acre, which would put you in some of the driest deserts, all the way to the tall grass prairie. So there is no static carrying capacity, which was one of the early goals of the Jornada, was to establish that sort of carrying capacity recommendation. But natural variability presents both risks and opportunities, as we'll see. And we also learned that precise long-term monitoring is critical to understand and deal with this variability. Climate variability is certainly increasing in recent years, and it is projected to change further. So this is the coefficient. This is a measure of the intensity of variation on this axis, and this is data from our long-term climate station. And you can sort of see it's been, and we saw big variability in the 1950s. The variability itself has been variable. And then, of course, we see in the last 20 years that rainfall becoming even more variable. So this is the interannual variability, where one year is wet, the next year is very, very dry, the next year is very wet. That pattern is projected to intensify with climate models over time. So we're going to be dealing with more rather than less interannual variability. Another myth, the second myth, is the idea that these systems are inherently equilibrium. So equilibrium is different from stability. Stability means you don't vary in very important ways very much. Equilibrium means when you do get pushed away, you tend back through, for example, succession to a natural or healthy state. And of course, what we've learned, and is exemplified by a lot of Jornada research, is that there's often no going back once there's been significant change in vegetation and soils. We call these state transitions. So for example, at low points in vegetation cover, and you can see this in our quadrat data, a black grama grassland in 1935. This is what that same quadrat looked like in 1952, during the beginning of the 1950s drought. Sometime in here, it flipped over to a mesquite shrubland. So this is exactly the same place from 1935 to 2016. So at low points in vegetation cover, there's an opportunity for that system to reorganize around other plant species, in this case shrubs. In other cases, it might be invasive species like lemon lovegrass. And there's little evidence that management allows a return to that original state. Woody plant encroachment, of course, is our big issue on the Jornada and throughout a lot of the Southwest. We've also learned that vegetation change continues and spreads even after the disturbance is removed. So not only are you stuck there, but processes occurring at that patch can then spread across the landscape even if you don't add any additional disturbance to adjacent areas. This is primarily due to soil erosion. Certainly excluding grazing does not prevent transitions to grassland, as we've seen in some of our exclosures, when those exclosures are sort of in this front of shrub spread, which is shown there as black. So ecological feedbacks then can reinforce these new states, where wind erosion can hurt the grasses and favor the shrubs. That allows, as those grasses decline, the shrubs get in, they're able to benefit, they can then compete with grasses for soil water, and of course that lack of interspaced vegetation allows for wind erosion that then deposits nutrients on those shrub mounds and reinforces this cycle. So that's very important, and you'll see this today on the Jornada, this pattern. So how do we restore? How do we manage within a system like ours, and even more generally dealing with ecological feedbacks of various kinds that require us to reset them? We have to think about resetting them in order to get some degree of grass recovery. We're going to see an example at Station 2 today of some surprising levels of grass recovery in response to extreme high rainfall periods such as our 2006 to 2008 period. We often talk about the seminal moments in our learning as being the 1950s drought, 1951 to 1956. As we move forward in our science, we're going to see this period 2006 to 2008 where we began with a very high rainfall year. We happened to get another high rainfall year, and then Hurricane Dolly came through, the remnants, and dumped a lot more rain. So we had 3 years consecutive very high rainfall. And there are parts of the Jornada and parts elsewhere in the region that were transformed by this sequence of rainfall events. We have grasses in pasture 2 covering our mesquite dunes in this case, and a lot of them have persisted to this day. We can graze that now where it hadn't been grazed for decades before that. In other cases, where we have soils that are perhaps more saturated with shrub roots, and the shrub competition for soil water is a major constraint to taking advantage of these rainfall events, then shrub mortality can be used to reduce competition and allow for these extreme events to cause grass recovery. And there may be other interventions as well. And this is the basic rationale for the New Mexico Restore New Mexico program being implemented by the Bureau of Land Management and NRCS and the Soil Water Conservation District. But it's important to recognize that the resulting grasslands that we get out of all of these efforts, the natural events as well as the ones we try to manage, they never quite get us back to what we had before. There's not a black grama grassland with yucca blooming in the mesquite dunes. We have created what we often talk about as a novel ecosystem that has ecosystem services that we like. It stabilizes the soil. It provides forage. It provides habitat, but it's not what it was. And I think that's an important idea that we're having to wrestle with, and that restoration ecologists across the world are wrestling with at the moment. The third myth that we're going to dispel is homogeneity. The idea that things are sufficiently similar everywhere that a rule or a study that's developed in one place can be extrapolated without much thought to the Southwest, to drylands of the world, for example. And what we find is that spatial variation is very important for our understanding of systems and management. Outcomes of management, for example, depend very strongly on climate, landscape position, soils, as well as historical legacies that are often invisible. This is an image based upon remote sensing and other variables that are mapping out variations in net primary production within a landscape. I want to get a t-shirt. Maybe we'll have this on t-shirts for sale one day, tie-dye, with science. And then we have soil groups in southwestern New Mexico region that highlight some of the big variations through the Ecological Site Program and the Soil Survey Program that we know are really important in vegetation trajectories. So we have some of this information. And what we've learned by looking at ecological change with respect to these axes of variation is that very subtle variations can have really big effects. This is some of Dawn Browning's work. You're going to see Dawn today at Station 1. And what she showed is that patterns of grass loss on this bottom graph. On a deep sandy soil and a shallow sandy soil, we can see the pattern here over time based upon repeat aerial photos. And patterns of shrub spread are influenced by subtle subsoil variations in the depth to the argillic horizon, the clay-rich horizon, or a caliche horizon. Okay? So these are things, you look at the surface, it's sandy. But underneath the soil, somewhere between, 15, 20, 30, 50 centimeters, there are these variations that are very important to the outcome of shrub encroachment and grass loss processes. We also see that soil and climate variation have important effects on restoration success. So these are some data that were generated through our collaboration with the Bureau of Land Management and other agencies to monitor the effects of brush management, herbicide applications in creosote shrublands on patterns of grass recovery. And what we see here are two cases where we are starting off in a mixed grass shrub state, and we see this bar here is the net increase in grass below 5,000 feet and the net increase in grass, the treatment relative to the control, above 5,000 feet. So this is a really big effect that points to how just crossing a boundary in elevation can cause very different outcomes. So these are types of patterns that have really heretofore been invisible to us, focusing on really small plots just on the Jornada. We have to get out into the surrounding landscape. And in order to do that, collaboration is essential. So once again, our thanks to the Restore New Mexico partners for helping us design these treatments to integrate our monitoring and our science with these treatments that are taking place across multiple parts, multiple properties throughout southwest New Mexico. So we need that to implement these programs, and we also need site-specific knowledge to make sense of the patterns that we're seeing. Why is the Jornada still here? We had the sustainability crisis in 1912. We kind of had another sustainability crisis, at least within the ranch, in the 1950s. But we still have sustainability challenges that we're facing now. this is the summary of the ecological challenges that we've detected and many others in the scientific community have reinforced. High and increasing variability in climate, particularly hotter droughts, are on deck. Permanently altered vegetation and ecosystem processes that are favoring shrublands. Everything is conspiring to make more shrublands at the expense of grasslands in our region and many other regions. And the problem, not so much a change, but just an inherent problem of important spatial variations that we have to be able to quantify and work into management tools in order for people to deal with spatial variations that are going to affect ongoing vegetation change and its effects on agriculture and the environment. So that's the ecological context. There's also a societal context. Limitations to farm and ranch income associated with lost forage productivity, drought, increasing costs. We have land conversion toward urban and energy development in many parts of the Southwest that are changing the economics and the demographics of these regions. Increasing interest in combining food production and conservation is really an opportunity for us at the present time, and there's ways to exploit that, such as through grass-fed beef, for example, and an increasing demand for participation in and understanding of science. So not the model that we have very often used in the past, where we do some science on the Jornada, we publish a paper, we write the summary abstract, and you have to go find it on our website, right? That sort of delivery model of science. We can work with people, they can help us define the scientific problem and work with us in implementing and interpreting it. So, there are a number of programs that we have built here over the last couple of decades to address these challenges. And this is perhaps going to be our route today. We come in, so we're going to visit a number of stations. The map of the stations is in your packet. There are going to be some to the south and one to the north of headquarters, and then we're going to have a number of stations at our ranch headquarters. So our first, there's sort of 4 categories of programs that we're going to talk about: ecological research, monitoring tools, which are then used to sort of link the ecological research that we do to places on the ground and make interpretations, agricultural adaptation, and information delivery and education. So with regard to ecological research, you're going to hear about the Jornada Basin Long-Term Ecological Research Program. At Station 1, we're going to focus primarily on the relationship between climate, so there's an indication of agriculture, and the future of grassland shrubland transitions. So what we've learned and what we expect is going to occur in the coming decades in response to changes in climate patterns with regard to grassland shrubland transitions. So this is sort of dealing with the problem, talking about the problem we've dealt with for many decades now, and then this is a relatively new theme for us, restoration. I mean, it was an old theme in the 1930s, but we kind of gave up with the idea that state transitions are irreversible. We can't get back. And of course, we kept planting bags of black granite. We weren't really thinking about, other ways of making these systems better, even if they were different. And so Deb Peters and Bob Schooley are going to talk about the implications of restoration for both plants and wildlife. With regard to monitoring tools, we're going to learn about some standardized rangeland monitoring tools and programs that are being used for collaborative science at Station 3. And we're going to also hear about some leveraging. So we gather this field data, and you get vegetation data, maybe you get gap size. You're characterizing the vegetation and soils of that ecosystem. But there is the possibility to use modeling and select measurements combined with process measurements actually create local interpretations, for example, susceptibility to wind erosion, which provides information that you might not otherwise have and that could be important for management decision making. And so that will also be discussed as part of the National Wind Erosion Research Network, being led by Nick Webb, who will describe their efforts at gathering the data to support this model. Then we're going to talk about agricultural adaptation. We have these systems that have changed. We have the ability to detect and anticipate these changes. How can we deal with the changes we know are coming? One of those stations is going to focus on the USDA Long-Term Agroecosystem Research Network. This is a new network within USDA that was created in 2012. And we were designated as a site at that time, one of the initial sites. So you're going to hear a little bit about that program and its focus on increasing agricultural production as well as environmental quality. And then one of the directions that we're looking into is livestock adaptations to harsh environments, particularly using the Raramuri criollo biotype. And so you'll hear about that. We have many partners now across the world, including Mexico and Argentina. We have a representative from our Mexican colleagues here today. And we also are collaborating with a number of ranches throughout the Southwest that are also represented here. And then finally, information delivery and education. So we have a lot of information. A lot of information is being produced by other people. How do we connect it to people? One of those programs, the USDA Southwest Climate Hub, is also a network that we are fortunate to participate in, and we represent here at the Jornada the Southwest region, including a number of the southwestern states: Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and then the what? Hawaii, and then yes, and then the islands. So we have we span a little bit of rainfall gradient. And as you might imagine, there's a lot of requests to do field work in Hawaii and the outlying islands. But this is really important because it not only touches on synthesis of climate information, but climate is the primary challenge to ecology and agriculture. It runs through all of our programs. All of our results point to the importance of climate variability and its increasing importance going forward. Another program that we'll hear about is the Land Potential Knowledge System that is using mobile devices and cloud computing for site-specific management information. And so the idea here is that information that lives on the cloud could be accessed by a mobile phone and linked to properties of your site. So you send soil information, it gathers the climate information that's already available by your geolocation, the GPS in your phone, and then a whole suite of information about how to manage that site sustainably, and any other information can then be transferred to your phone. The technical challenges of achieving that, and of course how you distill the information, is a very big challenge. And so you'll see some progress for this very general concept today. And then finally, the Asombro Institute for Science Education is going to present on their K-12 education programs that really touch on and integrate all of these programs and deliver this information to the K-12 audience. They also serve the general public. But what's important is we need people to understand the science process in order to participate in it and to make decisions based upon the information we provide. And so this program has been incredibly successful in developing new strategies to get people to understand and become involved in science. And they reach tens of thousands of kids over the years. So, thank you once again for participating in a very long-term tradition. I was like delighted, so I've been the research leader here. I probably didn't even introduce myself, did I? Brandon Bestelmeyer. You've been listening to. I've been the research leader for a couple of years now as a scientist. I started as a postdoc here. Started as a graduate student working here a long time ago, then became a postdoc and just have loved this part of the world for many years. But when I started digging in and started thinking about, you know, research leaderdom, it was really interesting to get into our photo archive and see all of these efforts over the years. And this common thread, even though the science has evolved, the problems have evolved, the idea that science gets performed and people get together to hear about it and to talk to each other about it. It's something that runs through, and so this is now 90 plus years, if my math is correct, that we've been doing it.